Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's session on reopening stories. I'm going to wait a couple more minutes, or maybe one more minute, because we've got a few more people expected to attend. So I just want to make sure we start with everybody. We will be recording today's session, so if they miss the start, then I suppose they can come back and catch up. But we'll give them 1 minute's grace, I think. Great. I think we'll get started there. I think anybody else who comes can catch up later, I say. So hello, good afternoon, welcome everyone. I'm Tom Stickland. I'm the Theatres Adviser at the Theatres Trust. Today we're going to be looking at the current situation with reopening theatres and hear from some experts on how we can best prepare our theatres, and also hear from some theatre operators about their approach and what they're doing to be able to prepare for and reopen those doors. Today's session is going to be recorded and will be available on the Theatres Trust website. Probably I should say at the top of the recording that the date today is the 21st of October 2020, because the guidelines change so quickly that I think it's very important to kind of mark that moment. So if you're watching the recording of this, bear in mind that the regulations have probably changed. I'd ask if you keep yourselves on mute throughout. We might have an opportunity to come to you with follow-ups to questions later on. You can unmute yourselves then, but if you keep yourself on mute throughout the meeting, that would be very useful. We'll try and make time for that Q&A at the end of each session. If you have a question, please type it in the chat. I find writing question in caps at the start helps us to spot that. Natasha Berg, who is logged on as Theatres Trust, is monitoring the chat there and asking questions. So if you want to fire a question that you don't necessarily want to attribute to yourself, but you'd like us to ask it, then you can fire it directly to Theatres Trust, and she'll answer that for you. Allow me, before I kick off, just a quick moment to introduce the Theatres Trust. We're the National Advisory Public Body for Theatres. We offer free advice to theatre operators and owners and local authorities about how to use theatre buildings, how to adapt them and how to protect them. Since March, we've changed a few things that we focus ourselves on, and have tried to stay up to speed with informing theatre operators with changes in legislation, identifying routes to funding as it's become available, and to direct you to emerging best practice as we become aware of it. We continue to be a free service to help signpost you to the latest guidance, and have introduced a couple more opportunities for support. While we receive no direct government funding, we are an arm's length body of DCMS, and we've been making the case to Treasury for support for the sector from day one, and are in regular contact with the government to provide data and suggest where support is needed. The Theatres Trust's grant programme has been repurposed to support theatres with grants up to £5,000 towards the additional costs of reopening, some of which we'll probably be talking about down later in the session. This is going to be a rolling scheme which we are hoping to be able to run right through to the end of this financial year. And we're also supporting theatres to run crowdfunders under the hashtag Save Our Theatres. This campaign has topped over £1 million this week and is continuing to grow. So if your theatre is looking at a crowdfunder, then definitely kind of come and get involved under that umbrella, because it's really kind of driving some additional funding towards theatres as they desperately need it. We've also recruited David Jubb, the former, who I think might be on this call, the former Artistic Director and Chief Executive of Battersea Arts Centre, to offer what we're calling an enhanced advice service, but really that's to support theatre leaders as they begin to reimagine a future for their organisations and face the difficulty of supporting their own staff through these challenging times. Feel free to email me if that's something that you think would be helpful to your organisation. Earlier this year, I was talking to theatre operators such as yourselves about scenario planning and applying for the Cultural Recovery Fund. And this has been made possible with the support of the Garfield Weston Foundation, who've given us a bit of funding. And we're now able to run a few more of those sessions. So to flag up, there's more of these to come, one on managing organisations in financial distress and one on insurance Q&A. So so mark those in your diary, and I'd like to thank Garfield Weston Foundation for that funding. I also like to thank the speakers who are speaking today, who have volunteered their time to help out. So on to reopening. We're a UK-wide body, and I appreciate that reopening is at different stages in different nations, and I hope that the information that's discussed today is relevant for you, for your planning, even if reopening for your theatre is not imminent. Theatre has always been about the live, being in the room, and the now unfortunate phrase of shared breath. How do we reopen buildings with hundreds of people in one room for an hour or more and keep them safe? I hope that you'll come away from today not just laden with the regulations, but also with a sense of hope that there are inventive ways of surviving. Someone shared with me a tweet with the seats that were out of use at the Watermill Theatre, not blocked off with a menacing cross, but wrapped with a bow as presents for the future. And I hope that kind of is a bit of a sentiment of there are ways that people are approaching this in a positive way, and it's very challenging, I understand, but trying to maintain that can-do attitude that theatre is famous for. Today, most of the conversation will be focusing about, from the audience's perspective, of social distancing and ventilation in the auditorium, but theatres mustn't overlook the backstage safety and creating fixed teams, avoiding cross-contamination, minimising the number of people in the rehearsal room, ensuring that face-to-face contact is reduced, not only a duty to the performers and crew, but also at the risk that the infection could have on the viability of the production to go ahead. The guidance goes into detail about all of the backstage spaces and how to approach making them COVID secure, the current performing arts guidance. From our conversations with theatres, we've seen the three pillars of a successful reopening are about compliance, which is following the most up-to-date guidance to minimise the risk of infection. Comfort, ensuring that we're creating welcoming spaces where audiences can enjoy a visit, can actually access the services and feel safe while doing it. And then cash flow, that vital thing of how are we able to create productions that make sense, that are viable in the financial sense, with the reduced capacities that we're talking about. Now, with the English guidance here, which is what we'll focus on as it's the most developed. It was published on the Performing Arts Guidance was published on the 11th of May. I think, Tash, if you could post the latest link to that in the chat, that would be really helpful. Hopefully you're all familiar and have read this. This is the Bible. This is what you should be making sure as a minimum requirement you're achieving in your COVID secure theatre workspace. It's very fast changing. The most recent update on this guidance was this morning. So hopefully everything that I say to you is up to date. I've been through it, but everything is with the proviso of the best thing for you to do is to do your risk assessment, check for updates in regulation, and then review your risk assessment regularly to make sure that you're staying up to date with this. As with many things to do with coronavirus, we're moving as the science evolves, and so everything is liable to change, and the different approaches a different approach taken by the government will affect what theatres can and can't do. The language of social distancing has become commonplace. Current restrictions talk of 2 meters or 1 meter plus with additional mitigation measures. 2 meters is still the best way of preventing the spread, but obviously has a massive impact on the viability of performances. With the coming in of the 3-tier system, with the coming in of the 3-tier system, all tiers, in all tiers, audiences must remain socially distanced from audiences outside of their household or support bubble. You should be making sure that this is made clear to patrons when they book. In tier 2, people from different households are not able to mix indoors, but this doesn't actually affect many theatres if they're implementing that first point, because theatres should be checking that audiences are booking as individual household groups or support bubbles at any stage, because if you're obviously sat in a seat next to somebody, you can't be socially distanced from them. Now, social distancing, also worth noting, does not just apply when you're in the seats, and you have to consider the whole movement around the building. Where are their pinch points and how can you avoid them? In tier 3, theatres are not required to close unless there's local restrictions in place specifically ordering it, but theatres should consider whether audiences would feel safe to attend at those times and are able to journey in. Different local authorities have interpreted that guidance in different ways, but today's update makes clear that at least 1 metre distancing must be maintained nose to nose. So there's been a lot of debate about how should we be measuring that, and it was clarified in today's update to the Performing Arts Guidelines. Then we get to start talking about the different mitigation measures that theatres have put in place. The wearing of masks by staff and audiences, barring limited exemptions, and participation in track and trace is now mandatory for theatres. Theatre staff must be actively reminding audiences to wear their mask unless eating, drinking, or exempt. The key mitigation factor that's emerging is proper ventilation of these spaces, which mitigates the risk by taking potentially infected particles away as quickly as possible. More on that from Buro Happold later. You must consider undertake a risk assessment around your cleaning regime. Most venues typically are cleaning their venue thoroughly between every performance, and then some are additionally undertaking antibacterial measures such as seat fogging on a weekly or fortnightly basis. But you have to make sure that there's enough time between performances in order to be able to clean your venues. With food and drink, the current regulations say theatres in tier 1 and 2 are exempt from the table service requirement, which applies to other restaurants and pubs that are serving alcohol. This means you can open your bars, but you'd want to consider whether you need to put in extra mitigation measures as a high contact place. So you might want to put a perspex screen or something like that in to help protect your staff and the audiences. It's worth noting that the 10 p.m. curfew still applies for the sale of alcohol across the board, but as long as your show starts before 10 p.m, the 10 p.m. curfew only applies to the performance and not, the 10 p.m. curfew only applies to the sale of alcohol and not to your performance. I'll say it the right way around. In tier 3, the sale of alcohol is not permitted at all. Now, audiences are likely to be nervous attending the theatre, unsure of the risk level and cautious about returning to a space with so many people in. We're encouraging theatres to make clear the COVID secure approaches that they've taken pre-booking and on signage throughout the venue. They should also consider the ticketing policies, allowing people to rebook for whole parties if one member is ill or required to self-isolate. Best practice is emerging as using e-ticketing to avoid having to handle physical tickets, which are a transmission risk. While the guidelines don't require it, many theatres have opted to introduce fever screening, taking temperatures with thermal cameras or thermometer guns, and barring entry to those patrons exhibiting a high temperature. If that's the approach that's taken, then you'll need to ensure that your staff have the training and understand the approach they should take when refusing entry to patrons, because it is a potentially difficult situation. And it could be very easy to overlook your duty to make sure that your building and your performances are as accessible as possible. We at Theatres Trust, we've signed up for the 7 inclusive principles, which have been put together as a way of reminding theatres that of their responsibilities under the Equality Act, and also how it's beneficial to engage with their disabled user groups in creating equality impact assessments and the like for all of these measures. I see Tash has just posted those in the chat there now. The thing that we would flag is that other regulations continue to apply. Even though COVID security seems to be the thing that you're thinking about, top of that list, you have to consider the impact on your fire risk assessment and other safety around the venue in implementing these measures. Make sure that you aren't impairing access to fire doors and by putting in barriers to one-way systems and things like that. So that's definitely something to flag. And finally, I just touch on, while you may now be permitted to reopen your theatres, you have to question whether it's viable to do so. Obviously, the reduced capacity has a massive impact on the sorts of performances that you'll be able to put on and the sorts of income that you'll generate from there. It may be that a decision is made to continue operating a loss to protect the relationship with an audience or to deliver kind of important work that you want to deliver. However, you have to consider long-term business planning of how long you can afford to do that. We aren't forecasting fuller audiences to be possible before spring next year, and it could be beyond that. So it could be that you need to go through a process of reimagining what your organisation can do to continue to deliver value, and think about new ways of approaching things. To repeat myself from across this whole thing, read the guidance, read the performing arts guidance, and check that your building is up to date with whatever the current up-to-date approach is. I identified earlier that the key mitigation that seems to be emerging, that is the thing that theatres can do to really minimise the spread, is that ventilation. And so I'm going to hand over now to Duncan, Campbell and Stephen Jolly from Buro Happold to talk to us about what that means for your theatre and how you can implement changes to improve the ventilation. Duncan.
Thanks, Tom. Let me just work out how to share my screen. Do that.
Yeah, it looks like it's working.
So you're looking at a PowerPoint presentation. Can you see that? Excellent. So yeah, just to very briefly introduce myself. So I'm Duncan Campbell, and Stephen Jolly is on the call as well. And I think for simplicity's sake, I'm going to run through this presentation, and then Stephen and I are very happy to cover questions as well, should you have any that arise from it. As Tom has been stressing, this is a moving field of guidance, so please do ensure that you are following the most up-to-date information that you can find. And thank you very much to the Theatres Trust for asking us to get involved in this. We're very, very happy to do that as well. So I think I'm down to speak for 15 minutes and I've got about 30 slides. So I'm going to go through it one heck of a pace. So apologies if you get lost at any point, or if you want me to go back over things, I'm very happy to do that as well. So this presentation is going to be a summary of current guidance on ventilation systems in the context of COVID-19. Subtitles: "He shall not breathe infection in this air." I was very, very pleased when I found a quote from Shakespeare that was so relevant. Of course, at that time, the main concern was around plague, and of course the theatres were closed for significant periods of Shakespeare's life when he was due to plague, and when he took the opportunity to write some of his masterpieces. So this presentation is going to cover the impact of ventilation on COVID transmission. So we'll start by looking at how COVID-19 is transmitted, potential impacts of the ventilation system, understanding what existing systems you have in your venues, practical steps that you can take to manage those, and then a little bit on what you can do by way of new installations. So I appreciate that this is going to be a very diverse audience, coming from venues from small scale venues to large scale venues, and with a range of backgrounds. Hopefully there's something in this for you and you find it helpful and useful. So in terms of understanding COVID transmission routes, so one of the challenges is that this is a new disease, which has only really been known about for the last year. So a lot of the research into this is limited and is very heavily caveated and generally based on small amounts of data. But what has been clearly identified is that there are three key routes of transmission of the virus. So surface contact, referred to as fomite transmission. So that is hand to hand, hand to surface, and is probably the one that we control through washing hands and cleaning venues. On a surface, there's evidence that the virus can remain active for 2 to 3 days if it's not cleaned off. The second method is what's referred to as large droplet transmission. So that is generally from people coughing, sneezing, can be from talking or singing, and these are droplets of a reasonable size. For large droplet transmission to happen, you need to be relatively close to the person who is infected. And also large droplet transmission is how the virus attaches itself to surfaces in the first place. The third and probably least understood method of transmission is what's referred to as aerosol transmission. So as those droplets evaporate in the air, and they evaporate very rapidly, they become droplets of much smaller size that effectively are dissolved in the air, and they can move around with air within the space. And this is the reason that indoor spaces are felt to be a higher transmission risk than outdoor spaces. There is also evidence that that virus can remain active in these very small droplets for 2 to 3 hours. There's also an identified transmission route referred to as fecal aerosol transmission from toilet facilities, which is revolting but true. Just to give you a sense of the size of the virus itself, a single COVID-19 virus is around about 0.1 micrometers in size. When we're talking about the aerosol transmission, so that's where the droplets are evaporated in air, they're about 100 to 1,000 times bigger than those single viruses. So it's groups of viruses, it's viruses mixed with other things. Once you're into the large droplets, once you're up at 60 micrometers and bigger, you're getting towards the size that is visible to the naked eye. And it is those kind of larger elements that you can imagine being expelled through coughing or sneezing. So with large droplet transmission, the distance over which that is an effective method of transmission is linked into gravity. So these large droplets eventually fall, and it is a distance of 1.5 to 2 meters, which is where that social distancing distance comes from. So that's why that is such a key distance. You can control that with PPE, so masks to prevent those droplets being emitted, visors, physical barriers. Those are the kind of keys to protecting a large droplet transmission, as well as that social distancing issue. Aerosol transmission is those evaporated droplets. Now, the concentration of virus is much closer to the infected person, even in an aerosol. So as they cough or sneeze, those droplets are evaporated and you get a high concentration of aerosols adjacent to them. So distance is still a key element to it. What makes it slightly more challenging is that once they're evaporated, then lower concentrations of that viral load can then move on air currents over long distances, and there's 2 to 3 hours of viral life that can happen for. And what the research doesn't indicate at the moment is what is a safe level of COVID virus to be exposed to in terms of concentration. There's evidence that high viral loads are obviously linked to infection, but it's hard to say that this is whatever it is a safe level of viral load. So you can control that with distance. So the further you are away from an infected person, again, that has a big impact. But you can also control it with ventilation. And there's two aspects to that. One is the air change rate, so how much fresh air you're putting into the space. And the other is the way that that air is distributed. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. So the ventilation rate is the amount of fresh air that you're putting into a space. And that is usually measured in air changes per hour or liters per second per person within that space. And that affects the concentration of contaminants, in this case, the COVID-19 virus, within the space. So the higher the air change rate, the lower that concentration. The airflow pattern affects how those contaminants are distributed. So if you can control airflows such that they take those contaminants away from other people, you're going to mitigate the risk of infection within that space. So when we're thinking about ventilation systems, the optimum is to provide high volumes of fresh air, which are directed to move contaminants away from others to minimize that risk of infection. So the key part to kind of understand how you can modify the systems that you've got in your venues is to understand what those existing venues are. So generally, we define those systems into three separate things. We have natural ventilation systems, minimum fresh air ventilation systems, and full fresh air ventilation systems. Now, we're starting to get into some more kind of engineering type tables and diagrams now, so apologies if we're starting to get a bit more technical, but there's often confusion between what is a ventilation system and what is a cooling system. And this is partly because of the terminology that we use for them. So when we're talking about natural ventilation, we are talking about a system of opening windows or louvers that provides ventilation to that space, but also provides cooling. So when it's warm, you open the windows and it cools it down. When it's stuffy, you open the windows and it allows in fresh air. Now, a minimum fresh air system tends to have a separate ventilation system and a separate cooling system. So you may have wall-mounted units or ceiling-mounted units that are terminal units, which are served with chilled water or refrigerant, and they are there just to do the cooling. They aren't doing anything to do with the ventilation of that space. And then you would have a separate system for introducing fresh air. Now, one of the reasons that this gets confusing is because our main way of sensing as people whether a space is well ventilated tends to be linked to how warm it gets in that space. So when we put cooling into a space, it can feel like the air within that volume is fresher, but it isn't really. So the actual fresh air volume and the concentration of contaminants is based on the ventilation system, not on the air temperature. And then when you move into a full fresh air system, which might be typical of a larger auditorium space, with these you will have a central network of ductwork. So ductwork, which is delivering air to the space, which is doing both the cooling and the ventilation to that space. And again, that might be a large air handling unit, which has got integrated heating and cooling systems in it, so that the air that comes out into the space served is treated when it arrives at that space. And the design of those ventilation systems take into account the amount of ventilation that we provide to the occupants of that space. Now, there's two key documents that are probably the basis of ventilation systems within most performance spaces. So one is the Yellow Book, which sets out the technical requirements for theatres, and that sets a minimum recommended ventilation rate. And the other is the British Standard, which also comes through some of the CIBSE guidance. And again, that sets out the ventilation rates per occupant and classifies that into indoor air quality levels on a scale from 1 to 4. Now, worth noting on this is that there is an overlap between these two standards. So our main measure, our main proxy for measuring indoor air quality is the concentration of CO2 within a space, and that gets measured in ppm, parts per million. Now, the reason we use CO2 to measure indoor air quality is because it is linked to the number of people in that space. As we all breathe out carbon dioxide, it is also relatively easily measurable through devices where if you have a sophisticated ventilation system in your venue, you may well have CO2 sensors in that space. Now, the Yellow Book equivalent, based on the minimum fresh air for theatres, would give you what is estimated to be a moderate air quality in that space. So it is only one step below what would be classified as a low air quality in that space. Now, to illustrate some of these ideas, we've just done a little bit of analysis on an example building just to show you how the system installed may impact the ventilation and the air quality within a venue. So we have taken this building, which is an existing naturally ventilated theatre space. It has a seating capacity of around about 200 people. It's a 120-year-old building, and we euphemistically refer it to as relying on natural infiltration to ventilate that space. What we mean by that is that this building leaks. So when the wind hits it, outside air comes into it, and that is the only form of ventilation in that space. So there's no controlled ventilation to it. Now, we've then built an analysis model of that. We have put in a simulation of a number of people sat within that venue and some lighting, some stage lighting in that space, just to start to try and understand how air quality could be impacted by the different ventilation systems that are available. So the starting point of that is just to work out a base case. So we have said, okay, let's say we can get about 50% of the audience into that space at the moment, and we're going to rely on just that natural infiltration, that leakiness of the building to ventilate that space. And for our simulation, we've simulated a performance which starts at 6:30. It's a winter performance. And what we found by analysing that, so we analyse it and we look at how the wind impacts on that building, when people arrive at that venue, what happens to the temperature in that space, and we do it over a number of days. And we've looked at it for the worst case day for this example. And under that simulation, starting with good air quality at 6:30, by 9 o'clock in the evening, the air quality in that space would be considered to be of low air quality. The kind of next level of intervention up is when we start to control that natural ventilation. So we introduce openings into the building which allow natural ventilation air into that space. Now, again, we've taken the same base case, but now we've added openable windows to it. We've given them a particular area. Now, under this scenario, by controlling those window openings, we've managed to limit that CO2 concentration to 1,000 parts per million at the same time in the evening. Now, that is giving moderate air quality. Now, the big challenge for that for a winter performance is obviously the internal temperature starts to drop. So with that system, you're ending up having to balance audience comfort against air quality in that space. And we can use that air quality as a proxy for some way of measuring the risk of COVID cross-transmission if you have somebody who is infected in that audience. And then the final option we've looked at is to see what would be the impact of introducing a mechanical ventilation into that system into that space. Now here we obviously have a lot more control. We can treat the air as it comes into that space. We can heat it and cool it to suit. And under this set of circumstances, we introduce 4 air changes per hour continuously throughout that performance. And we can control the CO2 concentration at around 800 parts per million, which would be classified as medium air quality. So even under these circumstances, we're not getting to the point where we're getting those kind of high air qualities. But that isn't to say that anyone can really give you any guidance on what level of air quality would be considered safe at the moment, because the research just isn't there to support that. So what are the practical steps that you could take within your venue to use that ventilation system to minimize those risks of transmission? So where you have natural ventilation systems, then there are a few simple steps that you can take. So you want to maximize the airflow through that space by opening those windows, opening those doors. You want to remove constraints to that flow of air. Things like curtains and blinds will stop that from happening. You want to encourage cross ventilation. So this is where you have openings on different sides of the building. Now, the reason that that is really beneficial is because that allows wind pressures on each side of the building to increase the flow of air through that space. Allied to that is stack-driven ventilation. So that is where we're relying on buoyancy forces from heat generated by the audience, for example, will drive ventilation through the air. Now, to encourage that, you need to be able to open windows at low level and at high level, and that encourages a flow of air through there. Even naturally ventilated buildings may have a number of extract systems as well, a number of mechanical systems. For example, on your WC extract systems or kitchen extract systems, if you maximize those extract volumes, that will encourage increased fresh air into that space as well. And where safe, it might be worth looking at opening internal doors between different spaces to allow that cross flow of air. You do have to be a bit careful with that. We need to make sure that you're not, for example, propping open fire doors that need to be closed for safety reasons. And then what about the pattern at which you ventilate that space? Think about opening windows and doors for an hour or two before a performance and after a performance to allow a purge, a flush of air through that space. Also, what about using the interval time, if you have one in a performance, to again flush the air within that auditorium? But clearly there are some challenges to doing this with a naturally ventilated system. So noise is obviously a key issue. So if you have a performance going on, you don't want too much excess noise from outside coming into your venue. Equally, you don't want to be disturbing the neighbours with noise coming from your venue to outside. Similarly, if you start to open up doors between different functions, if you've got a bar area or a cafe area, you're going to end up with noise moving from one to the other. Similarly, if you start to ramp up mechanical systems on those extract systems, you're going to be generating noise. So noise is a key challenge. As we've already highlighted, if you're introducing more cold air in winter, you're at risk of making the people who are coming to view to watch your performance uncomfortable. You'll also start to see increased heating and energy bills to compensate for that higher air change rate as well. And just one thing to note, if you have mechanical extract systems on your toilets, do not open the windows to those spaces to increase your natural ventilation flows, because you're at risk of positively pressurizing those toilets. We mentioned that fecal aerosol transmission route, which we don't want to be disturbing the pressure regimes within spaces, which that might do. With mechanical ventilation systems, In some ways, it's much more straightforward to make some of these modifications that could potentially reduce the risk of infection. So maximize the air volume on your system. You might need to talk to your facilities managers, to whoever maintains your mechanical ventilation systems, and get them to revisit site to recommission those systems to increase the air volumes. Recirculation systems, which is where the cooling relies on pulling air out of a space and cooling it and putting it back in, should be bypassed. So we want to make sure that we are bringing in the maximum amount of fresh air and we aren't recirculating air that could be contaminated back into that space. Clearly, you want to make sure that your systems are correctly maintained and commissioned. There are certain types of heat recovery device, such as thermal wheels, that potentially have high leakages between your extract system and your supply system. If that system is correctly maintained, then there's minimal risk from those systems. And again, think about your operating times of your systems. Maybe run them on for 2 or 3 hours before and after each performance, just to purge that space, as the virus has a potential 2 to 3 hour life within the air as an aerosol. Then that would be another way of controlling that. And again, in terms of challenges from mechanical ventilation systems, noise again. So once you start ramping up ventilation systems, you're going to start affecting the noise generated by them, even if you have attenuation in place on those systems. If those systems have been sized for a particular heating and cooling system, once you start increasing your air volumes, again, you're going to start seeing an underperformance of those. So it might not get warm enough in winter or cool enough in summer compared to the design points. And again, you might start to see increasing heating bills and energy bills from the higher air change rate. And where there's a specific type of system, a displacement system, that relies on a particular volume of air coming into the space and achieving a flow of air up past people, which is really good at removing contaminants from that occupied area. If you start to increase that volume, there's a risk that airflow pattern can break down, and you can end up with mixing in that space, which might be more of a risk than the benefit you'd get from increased fresh air rates. In terms of new installations, so just if you have a budget to make modifications to your systems, there's just a couple of things that we wanted to talk to you about. One, in terms of filter technology. So there are a number of systems in the market at the moment where people are marketing air purifiers or filters which can be installed on the system. So there's only a benefit to this where air is being recirculated and additional fresh air is not available. So the first option should be to introduce more fresh air rather than provide filtration. For it to be effective against COVID-19, that filtration system needs to be able to deal with very small particles. So it means it's the sorts of filtration systems that would normally be installed in a hospital environment, in an operating theatre, for example. So HEPA filtration, UV filtration, electrostatic filtration systems, anything which is just providing a grosser filtration than that won't be effective against COVID anyway. Once you're into these technical filtration systems, the capital cost of the filtration system itself is expensive, but they also require maintenance to be effective, and that maintenance itself can be expensive. So replacement HEPA filters, UV lamps are costly things. Some of these systems are being marketed that you could place within the performance space itself just to recirculate air locally. Now, there's very little research to demonstrate how effective that might be in a large volume space. So there is some evidence that for a small office type environment, recirculating that air locally through filters would take a viral load out of the air. Once you're into a large venue, even 100, 200 people, then the volume of air that you would need to turn over within that space in order to remove the very small levels of contaminants that a single infected person would provide would be big. So there's very little evidence that would be effective. So again, fresh air should be the first thing, more so than filtration, but that guidance and that research is still developing. So it might be something worth looking at. And then finally, what about for new ventilation systems? If you have the budget to do it, if you're looking at a new venue, then it would seem that from the current COVID research that a displacement type system is the gold standard for ventilation systems. in terms of removing contaminants. So this is where you might be introducing that ventilation air directly below your audience, directly below their seats, or integrated into the seat, and it allows the air to take those contaminants away from people. Also think about enhanced fresh air rates. So don't go for the minimum that can be that will comply with building regulations or meet the Yellow Book. It's worth looking at enhanced fresh air rates. Consider what sort of heat recovery systems are being put into that space. So there are heat recovery systems that have very little risk of cross-contamination between return and supply flows. But obviously we realize that it's a kind of luxurious position to be in if you can install a whole new ventilation system. So there are kind of steps down from that. So perhaps looking at providing extraction only systems, which could be operated during the performance, which will ensure that you're getting a level of fresh air rate through that performance space, through that auditorium space, throughout a performance. They're cheaper to install, possibly simpler to install. But just a few things to consider if you are looking at new or enhanced systems. So as well as the ventilation system, it will change your heating demands and cooling demands to from your space. Anything where you're introducing mechanical fans is likely to have an acoustic impact, and you need to take that into account in the design of those systems. You need to think about planning and building control approvals before doing works to the building, and clearly a number of venues will also be listed buildings, so be very careful about doing any works within listed buildings that without the proper consents in place. And again, just one more thing to think about, just watch out for any interfaces with existing fire and smoke systems within a space, because you don't want to end up doing something that potentially compromises a life safety system. Now, that is all we were going to run through today. I appreciate that I've kind of run through that, and it's very difficult to get any feedback from people on these Zoom calls, so I don't know if you've all fallen asleep partway through that, but we are very happy to answer any questions that you have, or I'll hand back over to Tom.
Great, thanks, Duncan. Really reassuring, I think, to hear that there are things that can be done even if you have just natural ventilation systems of just your windows. There's things to think about and how you can minimise that risk even in that situation. So yeah, a useful primer, I think, for a lot of people in lots of different venues. I wonder whether there's any questions in the chat. I don't see anything popping up, but did anybody ask anything offline there, Tash?
No, we haven't had any through. We had one earlier, but Duncan answered it in what he was saying.
Fabulous, fabulous. Great. So in which case we can move along to Katrina Gilroy at the Bridge Theatre. It was actually, I think, probably the first theatre that I actually managed to get along to myself since reopening. So very interesting to hear what their story's been. Are you here, Katrina?
I am, yes. Hello.
Excellent, great. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. Well, I have to really start with saying that the Bridge Theatre opened. It had an anniversary on the Saturday that just passed, which was 3 years. And I think many of the aspects for us being able to open in these challenging times is because the building is 3 years young. We indeed opened 8 weeks ago tomorrow with a reduced capacity for 250 socially distanced guest members from 900. Part of the reason that we were able to do that was that each seat is an individual seat, and the entire auditorium has a flexibility about flooring. So we stayed in the position when we had closed the building, which meant we were in a thrust format. And then for several weeks in the background, we were working out on formats. We were listening in the background. We were working at 2 meters. 2 meters was not going to be a possibility to ever open the doors. We took ourselves to 150, and then we got to the place where we were getting more confidence about 1 meter with a socially distance and mitigations to follow. So indeed, we've been up and running. Again, a fortunate coincidence or a piece of work that happened was the piece of work. So all of this is entirely tied into the function of the theatre. Could we do it physically? Then Nicholas Heitner had the opportunity. He was invited to do a series of small monologues for the BBC, which he thoroughly enjoyed because he actually did them on the set of EastEnders. So he found that hugely entertaining. And then we had the opportunity to actually consider immediately a program of work where we were effectively doing 2 pieces in pairs, but we never would have more than 1 performer at a time, or 2 at a time. And how we would technically introduce those shows, rehearse them, put them on the stage, do all the technical things, and open. I have to say the team, and I mean both front of house and rear of house, came from all being furloughed. There were 6 of us in our group who stayed not furloughed, which again had the benefits that we never really stopped. And I was learning new things, which actually came in to be very helpful at the same time, which was reminding myself what the plant room looked like, working with one colleague whilst we were doing lone working in the closure period. What it meant was having a sense of how we could reopen the building comfortably, do all of the routes, think through all the things that were coming along as guidance notes at that stage, because in fact I opened at just with permission at stage 4, but actually the guidance notes were only up from rehearsals through to stage 3. So I do have to say there's been a lot of things since we've opened, which I'm very pleased about, but at the time it was going, well, we're doing quite a lot of this ourselves, actually, which was all those things, creating bubbles, creating a committee of colleagues who would come on board in each different areas to be a voice each and every single week. I have a committee meeting at the start of the week. Everybody's entitled to give their opinion, have suggestions, and we feed in on that all the time, as well as running, of course, the very serious side of things, which is reporting people who may be feeling unwell, decisions that we need to take immediately about removing those people, either having testing, waiting for them to come back to us, which we're living with every single week. Some of the challenges in terms of perception before opening those doors, one of the biggest challenge was exactly that, perception, which I think is changing every single day and is increasingly becoming difficult for our audience members. I think the truth is that we had a relatively slow walk up. We had no idea how to anticipate opening the doors. The clusters of seating, for instance, was interesting. And we learnt a lesson relatively quickly, but we couldn't particularly change it, which was the appetite for more single seats than groups of 4. We are, as we're going to we've announced our next phase, we're actually changing some of that now so that we're offering up more single seats. So lots and lots of lessons all the time being learned. The whole sense of audience perception, we had no idea. I would say in the last 3 weeks, and I can't possibly explain why, other than obviously a confidence that from our audience members, perhaps some feedback, positivity generally, has meant that actually our box office has actually increasingly got better. Getting better only takes us, we hope, to break even and not going into loss. That's what we're working towards, break even. Some of the things that we put in to help the mitigations, to make the audience primarily, as well as obviously all our staff, but really, anybody stepping into the building, be it from stage door or through the front doors, is I followed the guidance of looking at the Palladium one-off day and all the lessons that they had captured from Seoul. We have invested in a thermal camera at the entrance. It goes down incredibly well with our audience members. It helps us manage singles or pairs of people coming in. It gives that immediate start of, there's a conversation pre-coming in through the doors, reading the ticket, all on reader, paperless. It gives then the opportunity again for a host to introduce and say, welcome, would you mind looking? And it just takes a few moments, but there's this personal moment. And then there's another person, which of course over the last few weeks we've changed again. There used to be people, we were allowing people, they were able to be in the bar foyer area. That changed 3 weeks ago. They now immediately need to go downstairs into their seats. Interestingly again, The bar sales as such, which is now delivery to a seat, so pre-order as much as possible, go to your seat, your drink arrives, has gone down a storm. People are loving it. And the bar sales have gone up, which I thought potentially was going to go the other way. And just moving on, obviously, in terms of rehearsals, the whole guidance of zoning the entire environment. I'm very, very lucky. It's not the most enormous theatre, but at the same time, being 3 years young, all the routes and being able to single traffic works. We're immensely prescriptive. We need to be. We're protecting every individual who's in the space. The zones work, the maps work. Everyone knows exactly where they're able to go. I mean, one of the, for me, one of the most delightful, and I'm grateful to actually, are my hosts. On any given day, we have 25 hosts in the space. They are no longer able to access the common green room area. They're no longer able to really stop by and say hi, which is all part of the, energy of the space. They arrive, they have a thermal check at stage door, they have units where they put their personal belongings in bags into, they have to go straight to their stations. If they're on a long day, I'm afraid the only facility I have for them is in the lower foyer for them to have a quick lunch. They're not actually allowed to come back again, rear a house. So it's a complete collective with every single colleague being invited in as a performer or a host or working behind the bar. Of course, we have huge implementation of cleaning, COVID cleaning, alongside the COVID committee team. I think in the industry, it felt very important that it wasn't just one person or just one or two people who had to be responsible. It's a collective. Ultimately, I am responsible, but I'm very appreciative of my colleagues who are helping me to keep the building and everyone who's working with us in the space healthy. And actually, as I say, we announced last week, we have a program of work now that will take us through to the end of January of 2021 in this socially distanced world. There we are, British Theatre.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I think the ability that you have to take out all of those other seats really changes that experience of coming into the theatre and feeling like you're actually in space. The feeling of in different theatres where you have to walk along an aisle is very different, isn't it? So I think a real luxury, and I think certainly something that brings a lot of comfort to audiences who can look around them and physically see space, even though the same space is probably there in rows. It's just a different psychological experience, isn't it?
Very much so, yes.
That's great. Any questions from attendees to ask about?
We had a request for a sort of discussion on how to best manage intervals and also how to manage off-limit seating. So I don't know if that's something Katrina might be able to shed some light.
Yeah, so maybe the first question is the one, is have you opted for intervals?
No, no, because although again we have terrific toilet facilities, two decisions: we needed to just keep moving people in to their seat position. Mm-hmm. Obviously they're able to go to the toilet beforehand, but the thought of too much movement, not in a controlled way, was a no-no. So no, we have not introduced. We have a pause, actually, funny enough, with one of the shows, which is around about 6 minutes, mm-hmm. which was actually on the request of the artist concerned, and that was fine. And I think I will be doing an event in a few weeks' time, which actually will actively encourage the doors being open and perhaps individuals just getting up and going to the bathroom in a much more relaxed way. But no, it was far too challenging. So no intervals.
Yeah, I think that's one where the design of a building has an impact on what's possible for where you have big open space foyers where it's less simple to direct people to follow a specific route. Like the bridge is very much a space for mingling by design, isn't it?
Yes.
Great. I think we'll move on if there's no other questions there. Great. So thank you very much, Katrina, and move on to Annabel Turpin from ARC Stockton, who hopefully is on the line. Are you unmuted there? Excellent.
I'm here. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Great.
Thanks, Tom. So just to give you hello everyone, it's really lovely to be here and it's been great to hear the talk so far. To give you a bit of context, ARC is a multi-art form centre in Stockton-on-Tees up in the northeast of England. So we have 3 performance spaces. You'd probably all call them theatres, we call them performance spaces, as well as a variety of kind of other facilities around the building. And we're really embedded in our local community. We use arts and cultural activity to support our local community. So we work locally in Stockton and the Tees Valley, but also nationally through our leadership of networks and partnerships. There's lots of practical things to say about reopening, and I realise that's why you're all here today. But I wanted to talk a little bit on the why and the how rather than what we did. And hopefully the reason for talking about those things and that focus will become clear. So we reopened in September because we felt it was really important that we opened up the building to our communities. And we felt that the initial sense of community spirit that we probably all experienced during those first few months of lockdown, we could sense that that was just beginning to dissolve a little bit locally as the kind of differences between the impact of COVID on different groups of people was really starting to emerge. And we really wanted to go back to being the safe and happy place that we were before, where people could connect with each other, where they could share their creativity and cultural experiences. There was lots of people doing creative things at home, but hadn't had that opportunity to share them. And also where they could be seen, and people felt very invisible in their houses. They weren't just lonely and isolated, but they also felt very ignored, maybe particularly in the north. And by reopening when we did, we sent a really strong message to our communities that we really cared about them. And I'm telling you this because I think knowing why you're reopening really guides what you do and how you do it. So for us, recognising that providing the place and the staff, the people to run it was really key for our communities, took the pressure off trying to reopen with a really extensive programme. It was enough initially to reopen with some film screenings and some of our regular classes, with reduced opening hours and a much reduced cafe bar service. And from that to kind of build up to where we are now in doing live performances. So I'd encourage anyone to really think about their motivations and priorities for reopening and use that to shape what you do rather than just trying to do what you did before. So the biggest challenge for ARC and for me hasn't actually really been around the practicalities. We've heard lots of really useful advice today about how to navigate your way through those guidelines. I think the bigger challenges have been around supporting staff who were furloughed or working from home, to support them to return to work, to feel safe, and just to adapt to everything being different. And I think Katrina talked a little bit about this as well. For me, this is really key because if you and your staff don't feel safe, then your customers won't either. So I wanted to share a few of the things that we've done that have really helped our reopening be such a success, and we do think it's been a success. We've, you know, the numbers of people coming through our building have been far higher than we expected. So the first thing is we've actively avoided comparing how things are now to how they were, or adopting a sense of when we get back to normal. So we've just embraced the change and we're supporting everyone, staff and customers, to just think that everything's new rather than it being temporary. Being in a temporary state for a long period of time is really tiring, as I'm sure everyone is experiencing. So yeah, we're just saying this is it for now. This is how things are. On a really practical level, we made sure that all the staff had the opportunity to come into the building for a one-to-one meeting before they came back to work. Because we discovered that many people were really nervous about coming back, even if they didn't initially say so. And it also gave staff the opportunity to actually see the work that was going into making the building COVID safe. So it took away a lot of their anxiety. And we shared all the new procedures with staff in writing ahead of that meeting, so they knew what to expect in advance and could ask any questions when they came in. And they also all had the opportunity to feed into the risk assessments. So the core set of risk assessments were done by our operations staff, but all staff had the opportunity to feed in, particularly around their particular areas of work. I think one of the most positive things, which has sort of come out of a bad thing, has been that all staff have had the opportunity to engage really directly with customers. So because of reduced staffing levels, all of our staff are working shifts on our track and trace desk, front of house and on the cafe bar. So they're all experiencing firsthand the impact we have on our communities, which is reinforcing that reason why we reopened. And I think hearing praise and encouragement from customers has been the most motivating thing. It's also obviously really helped people understand each other's jobs better. So it's helped bridge that gap that can sometimes exist between administrative and operational staff. We've probably over communicated, but that's felt really important. So as soon as uncertainty or rumour creeps in, anxiety levels rise. So we've worked really hard to keep everyone informed. We've had staff test positive for COVID in the last couple of weeks, but letting all staff know immediately and clarifying exactly what that means in terms of who needs to self-isolate has helped make people feel really safe and avoid that kind of speculation. And likewise, as all the new regulations and restrictions have been introduced, we've very, very quickly communicated what that means for us and our customers. There's no room for speculation. I think part of that communication has been about giving as much certainty as we can, even if that's meant stating what we aren't doing rather than what we are doing. So whilst externally, obviously, none of us know how long this is going to go on for, internally, we've tried to put our own timescales in place to help staff and customers really navigate the change. So introducing changes with the kind of, at least until this date, we're going to do this, means that people can plan with some degree of confidence. And I think that's prevented people getting tired and demotivated. So this might all sound very staff focused, but doing all this for staff means it naturally extends to customers. All the same principles apply. We've put staff at the heart of our customer communications, and we've asked people from all departments to feature in kind of short videos explaining our new ways of working. And not only has that helped customers feel safe, hearing directly from the people responsible for their safety and welfare, but it's given staff ownership over it too. And then just to end, ahead of today, I asked staff what the most surprising thing had been about reopening. And pretty much everyone said the positivity they encountered from customers and how eager and excited they were to come back and how safe they all felt. So I thought I'd share that as an end point because it was a really positive thing to hear back from everyone. So I'm conscious of time. I know there's a lot more to say, but I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Annabel. A different, very important perspective on actually the reality that these are people, both who we're dealing with and who we work with, who are all going through this moment together, and kind of acknowledging that is important, I think. My question is about, I'm going to jump in before anybody else can, is how do you prepare, how have you been preparing your staff and organisation for the risk of potential second lockdowns and the risk of if we have to close again?
It's a really important point, and I had meant to mention that and I'd forgotten, so I'm glad you reminded me. What we've tried to do is to say it's inevitable. Like, inevitably we're going to have to close again at some point, because the last thing we want is for everyone to be demotivated and stressed and think, oh, it's the end of the world, we've got to close again. So from the beginning, we've kind of said, we've done it once, we know how to do it now, we can probably do it even better next time, everything's in place. It's very likely that we'll have to close again, and we say that on an ongoing basis. And it's really just been about building up people's resilience, so that as and when, as I'm sure it will, that happens, everyone's like, oh, this is what we do now. We'll blow the dust off that plan we wrote in March and go through the process again. So yeah, I think it's been acknowledging it and, you know, in a sense, just making it part of what we're planning to do at some point.
Thanks. Any other questions coming up from anyone in attendance? I don't see anything in chat.
No.
Well, that's great. Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming along today, particularly our speakers. As I say, really valuable to get the insight that they've delivered to us. This is the first of a set of 3 seminars we'll be running over the coming weeks, but again, we're hoping to run even more after that on the guidance of what people actually want to hear about. So if you've attended today in any form and you'd like to suggest a topic for another seminar that you're particularly interested in an area of it, I know that kind of the mental health aspects of help supporting your staff is certainly one that's come up with queries that I've received in the past before. So all sorts of things that if you'd like to hear further seminars on, then do send us an email and we can look at pulling together something in the future. I have to thank Garfield Weston Foundation, who supported us with some funding for these. And thank you all for attending.